Good evening and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Tweedy Lecture this evening. This is a biennial lecture which is run to celebrate the lives of Hilary and Robert Tweedy, and especially to celebrate their, particularly in Hilary's case, her contributions to peace. Hilda, sorry, beg your pardon, Hilda, sorry about that. Hilda, who had an interest in peace, gender and human rights, and Robert, who had a particular interest in environmental issues, and that's going to be the subject of our lecture tonight. And so I particularly want to express our welcome to the members of the Tweedy family who are here this evening as well. Now, I've heard that there's a number of vacant seats tonight because we have another very important visitor, and a number of people who are trying to get here are having difficulty moving across the city. So there may be some people who get across and come in late, and there may be some who are unable to join us, which is unfortunate. Also, by coincidence, this year we are celebrating the tercentenary of the Botany Department here in Trinity. 300 years ago, the first appointment was made in botany, which makes the chair of botany one of the oldest in the world, in fact, which is quite significant. And we've got various events on over the year to celebrate this. And as well as looking back at the last 300 years, one thing in particular we want to do is also look forward and address some of the challenges that are facing us. And some of the big challenges which are facing not only the planet but humanity are things like the impacts of climate change, how we're going to feed the ever-increasing human population, which now is just about hitting 7 billion and increasing rapidly, what we're going to do as fossil fuels dwindle, what are we going to replace them with, and how we're going to find new medicines and so forth. And these are the sorts of challenges which are faced by plant scientists and drive their research. And particularly here in the Botany Department in Trinity, we have a very active research group which is informed, and they focus on these questions. And it also, of course, informs our teaching program. But it's very fitting association to have our celebrations with the Tweedy Lecture, because I think Hilary in particular would have been exercised about how these challenges would have impact on vulnerable people. And that's something that's, I think it's going to be a subject, and it relates back to the previous Tweedy lecture given by Mary Robinson as well, and the area that she's now developing quite extensively in climate justice. But also, when we try to tackle these issues, one of the things we're very concerned about is the environmental impact, how we maintain biodiversity, what's the impact of growing fossil fuels and so forth. And of course that's an area that would particularly have exercised Robert. And again, it's the area that we will be addressing in tonight's lecture. So I just want to close by just drawing attention to two recent events we've had in our celebrations. One was the planting of a physic garden, a medicinal garden, a small garden in the east end of the campus, down near the Western Row, Pier Street corner of the campus. And it's a small garden of 70 medicinal plants. And the idea is to bring to life where some medicines come from and raise that issue of where medicines come from. Some of them are of sort of ancient interest and with very little medicinal relevance today, but some of the plants like Taxol, which is used for developing cancer drugs and so forth, from Taxus baccata, which are of great interest today. And to go with that, there's a publication on that garden. It's absolutely free, and it can be picked up from the Science Gallery, and the garden is just outside the Science Gallery, so I encourage you to get that. And the other publication, just a couple of weeks ago, is The Trees of Trinity College, which is the third edition of this book, edited by Daniel Kelly and David Jeffrey, and it's just a guide to the trees on our campus, and it explains 3 different walks through the campus, explaining the trees. It's lavishly illustrated with photographs, maps, and some original paintings, watercolours that were done for it. And this is available, it's a snip at only €5, and it's available from the library shop and also from the Science Gallery. So I would encourage you to arm yourself with both these publications, and they will certainly enhance your walks through the campus. And so now I want to introduce Jean Tweedy Walker, who's going to say a few words, and in so doing present it with these 2 little booklets.
Thank you very much. Well, the Tweedy family, which includes myself, my brother Bob, my sister Elizabeth, and Bob's wife Anne, and Elizabeth's husband Alan, and son and a couple of grandsons. Very glad that everybody's here. So thank you all for coming. I wanted to congratulate botany on their 300 years. That is wonderful. I have wonderful reminiscences of being a botany student here, and I had the great privilege of having Dr. David Webb as one of my professors. Now, I also took zoology, and zoology taught us all about the birds and the bees, but it was botany who taught us about the intriguing sex life of the mosses and ferns, and to this day, I can't pass a fern leaf without turning it over and see what's going on underneath. So it was wonderful. But my father was he was deeply an advocate for the environment, and he also was a wonderful gardener. He liked all plants, whether they were wild or domesticated. And on Sundays, at Sunday lunch, he would come in from the garden and he'd give my mother a report. And he'd say, well, the tricuspidaria and the tradescantia and the skimmia, they're all doing very well. And of course, we three children would make up these Latin names and say that they were doing very well too. But his enthusiasm and love of gardening rubbed off. And in particular, but he also had a way with words. He loved the English language, and he came up with exotic words to us, and one of them that he really liked was bosky. Things were bosky. So great reminiscences of him also. And he introduced me to the Botanic Gardens, and he really loved the gardens there. And he would have loved that Dr. Jebb is giving this talk today. He would just be sitting here with rapt attention. So I want to thank Dr. Jebb for coming and giving us his time to give us this lecture. And to Dad and all things bosky. Thank you.
Right, well now it's finally my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Matthew Jebb, the director of the Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin, the National Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin. Just to give you a very brief background to Matthew, he did his primary degree in botany in Oxford and stayed on to do his DPhil. And then after that, many scientists who are following a career after their PhD tend to lock themselves in a dingy laboratory somewhere in isolation and get on with some obscure experiments, but not Matthew. He went off to Papua New Guinea for 5 years, and that's where he ran the Christensen Research Centre in Madang, which must have been a wonderful experience. And then he returned to Ireland. He didn't return to Ireland, but he came to Ireland then after that, and he worked here in the herbarium on a research post in the herbarium in the botany department in Trinity. And from there, he was appointed keeper of the herbarium in the National Botanic Gardens. And then last year, he was appointed the director. And many of you will know that Matthew features regularly on national television and radio, and his punctuation is always impeccable on those occasions. I think that must inform to a certain extent the title of tonight's talk, although we did admit at the reception that he wasn't responsible for the title, so I find the title intriguing, but we will find out more. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Matthew Jebb.
Right, that doesn't seem to be working, or it is. Perfect. Good evening, everybody. Yes, as Fraser explained there, the title was presented to me as an idea, and I rose to the challenge. I thought, well, why not? It's a suitable thing. I'd enjoyed reading Lynn Truss's book, and so it seemed an appropriate thing to talk about. When we talk about the flora of Ireland, it's very important to see it set in its landscape. And the intriguing thing about the Irish landscape is it sums up an amazing history. In many ways, people look back in time and they assume at some point in the past everything was pristine before human beings arrived. and despoiled it. Well, bizarrely, Ireland's flora and its human population probably arrived at about the same time. It's not as though Ireland sat in lonely isolation for thousands, if not millions of years, suddenly to have human beings arrive on its shores. About 12,000 years ago, when the last vestiges of the Ice Age had disappeared, back came the vegetation, and back came human beings at the same time. So one could say that the landscape of Ireland has never been pristine. It has always involved human beings, the human presence. And we leave our mark in a huge way. This slide here sums up to me the very major sort of realms of the Irish biota. We have hillsides above infields here where a little bit of soil has gathered at the bottom of a slope, where tillage can occur, crops can be grown here. Cattle, sheep can be looked after in the winter months. Any flat, wet land is covered by great bogs and mires and wet places, very inhospitable to agriculture, as are the hills. So this gentle strip of land at the edges of the mountains is no doubt very much responsible for the four major provinces of Ireland, in that four major mountain ranges define the island. Without human beings, forest returns. And it's a very resilient nature that springs back. In the Burren today, one of our biggest issues is the lack of farming. The lack of overgrazing is a problem because the forest grows back, the hazels here appear, in time ash forest will dominate, and the intriguing alpine flora that exists there today will be obliterated by the shade. But we can also see extraordinary levels of history in our bogs. This is on the shores of Loch Mask. Shan Valley Cahill is the townland, and it is an extraordinary forest. It is huge stumps of pines and a few oak trees. These are vast. These are 3 foot in diameter trees, gigantic trees. And they died where they stood about 4.5, maybe 5,000 years ago, when the climate of Ireland suddenly changed, became a great deal wetter. These forest giants literally died on their feet because the land became waterlogged, and that starvation of oxygen around their roots killed them. We also find extraordinary remnants of the activities of human beings. This is the Lurgan dugout canoe, which you can see. It's a huge log boat. It's exhibited to this day in the National Museum, and it's a remarkable sight. I can remember it from my very earliest youth, seeing this boat and being inspired by the scale of it. No doubt in those days it was too high for me to even look into. It's 50 foot long. It is a solid trunk of oak with not a single branch in it. There is no living oak tree in Ireland today of this scale. So 4,500 years ago, the trees were gigantic. And what is intriguing is this represents a facet of Ireland that demonstrates climate change is nothing new. This tree was buried underneath an enormous blanket bog around near Galway. It was chiseled out by some community of boat builders, but they never finished it. And it was only about 15 years ago that archaeologists looked at this boat and realized that it was an unfinished boat, i.e. it was filled with stones, it was sunk in the lake, and this was traditional where log boats are made in the world today. You always season your canoes underwater. The community that did all the work of felling this 50-foot log, dragging it to the lake, sinking it, and roughing it out, never returned to finish it off. Maybe they emigrated because of changing climate. So emigration is probably nothing new to Ireland. The bogs are remarkable for saving this amazing history of our flora and also our activities on this landscape. And this varies from the big to the small, from the microscopic pollen grains to features as large as that Lurgan dugout canoe. Some of the earliest botanists to visit the west of Ireland, and Edward Ludd, who was a Welsh ethnographer but also a botanist, in 1700 he was tramping across the bogs of Galway, and he spotted this remarkable heath, this heather here, with these huge bells, which the locals referred to as St. Davioch's Heath. We know it today as Daboesia because Linnaeus didn't like the Celtic arrangement of vowels, so he switched them round. So St. Davioch and Daboesia are spelt differently with the E and the O transposed. St. Davioch's Heath to Edward Lood was an extraordinary discovery because only a few years, literally 6 years earlier, de Tournefort had found this exact same species in northern Spain. And this is an early insight into the remarkable distribution of these plants. Edward Lood was collecting vocabularies and the language of the Celts. He visited Scotland, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, and gathered these together. But he also collected plants. And it was an insight into how the distribution of plants is sometimes bizarre. This plant in northern Spain grows in birch woodland, but in the bogs of Galway, it grows out in the open. So although exactly the same species, it has a very different approach to life in the two places. You can see the scale of these flowers, about 3/4 of an inch long, so it's a very impressive, large-sized heather. 1843, so again, more than 140 years later, William McCalla, a school teacher based in Roundstone, was walking across the great Roundstone bog, and you can see the mountains of Connemara in the background there, and he chanced upon this heather growing across the heath there, right in the centre of the bog, a very small area, no more than 1 or 2 square kilometres, which he couldn't identify. Here it is in close-up. He sent the flowers off to James Mackay, who was the curator of the Trinity Botanic Gardens, who likewise couldn't put a name to it, and it was sent on to Joseph Hooker in Kew, who at that same month received the identical species from northern Spain. So an extraordinary pattern here. This was named Erica Mackiana after Mackay, who sent it on from the Trinity Botanic Gardens, and alas, William McCalla's name is not honoured in its epithet. But when we go to the Roundstone Bog today, we see some extraordinary plants muscling in. We see gunnera, we see fuchsia, and the background here, rhododendron. Now you have to understand, where have these plants come from? It's extremely important when we look at what surrounds us as scientists